My uncle told me he'd invested my money wisely when I turned 25 and asked for my $340,000 inheritance. But when I pressed for details, he started making excuses. The market's been volatile, he'd say. We need to talk about timing. It's complicated right now. But what wasn't complicated was that he was avoiding actually giving me any account numbers or documentation. And 6 months later, when the judge calmly asked him to provide those account numbers in open court, my uncle stood up and started screaming, "You're tearing this family apart over money." My name is Marcus Thompson. I'm 27 years old. And the trial that destroyed my relationship with my uncle also revealed the truth about where my inheritance had actually gone. The money had come from my grandmother's estate. She'd passed away when I was 16 years old, suddenly from a massive heart attack. One day she was at my soccer game, cheering from the stands, and the next day she was gone. Her will had been comprehensive. She'd left specific instructions that were very clear. $340,000 in trust, to be managed by my uncle Robert Thompson until I turned 25 years old, at which point the entire sum would be transferred to me with all accumulated interest and gains. My uncle had seemed genuinely honored by the responsibility. He'd been the successful one in the family. At least, that's what everyone had always said, and what he'd always claimed. He owned commercial real estate properties. He had a nice house in an exclusive neighborhood. He wore expensive watches and drove luxury cars. He talked frequently about investments and market timing, and the importance of letting money grow rather than spending it impulsively. "I'll take excellent care of this," he'd told me at the funeral, his hand on my shoulder while I was still numb from grief. "Your grandmother trusted me, and I'll make sure you have something truly special when you turn 25. I'd believed him. Why wouldn't I? He was my uncle. He was family. And he had a reputation for being good with money. When I turned 25, I'd been preparing to use the inheritance to buy a house. My girlfriend and I had found a place. We'd been getting pre-approved for a mortgage. We'd been planning our future. I'd called my uncle and asked for the money. "Marcus, congratulations on turning 25, he'd said, his voice suddenly strained. "I need to talk to you about your inheritance. It's a bit complicated right now." "What do you mean complicated?" I'd asked. "The trust matures when I'm 25. I should be able to access the money." "You can," he'd said. "But the timing right now is suboptimal. The market's down. If we liquidate everything now, we'll lock in significant losses. I think we should wait. Let the investments recover. In 6 months, maybe a year, you'll have even more money." I'd been skeptical but not suspicious. The stock market had indeed been volatile. Maybe he was right. "Can you at least show me the account statements?" I'd asked. "So I can understand where the money is?" "Of course," he'd said. "I'll email you everything." But the statements never came. I'd called again a week later. "Uncle Robert, I didn't get the email." "Oh, right. I've been traveling for work. Let me get those to you when I'm back." But when he was back, there was another excuse. The account statements were at his office. He'd forward them next week. His accountant was managing everything now, and he needed to get them to compile a report. 6 months went by. 6 full months of excuses. 6 months of repeated requests for documentation. 6 months of my uncle growing increasingly evasive whenever I pressed for specifics about where the money actually was. By month 4, his tone had shifted dramatically. He'd gone from evasive to accusatory. "Marcus, you're being completely ungrateful," he'd said during one particularly hostile phone call. "I've been managing this money carefully. I've been making smart decisions on your behalf. The fact that you don't trust me is frankly insulting. I've devoted years to this responsibility." By month 5, he'd started threatening to refuse to give me the money at all. "Maybe you're not mature enough to handle it," he'd said. "Maybe you should continue to let me manage it. You'd probably just waste it anyway." By month 6, he'd simply refused to answer my calls. His voicemail would fill up. Text messages would go unanswered. When I'd tried reaching him through my aunt, he'd told her to tell me to stop harassing him about the trust. I'd hired a lawyer. Her name was Patricia Dawson, and she was straightforward about what she suspected. "The excuses are a classic pattern," she'd said during our first consultation. "The delays, the defensiveness, the shift to making you feel guilty for asking. This suggests he either made poor investments he's trying to hide, or," she'd paused, "or he's been using the money for himself. My uncle wouldn't do that," I'd said, even as I realized I wasn't sure that was true. "Let's find out," Patricia had said. Patricia had sent a formal letter requesting documentation of all trust accounts, investments, and fund movements. My uncle's response had come through his own attorney. The money was tied up in long-term investments, and he couldn't provide documentation without violating the terms of those investments. It was a lie. Patricia knew it was a lie. I knew it was a lie. But now we had to prove it. The trial had taken place in the courthouse in downtown Boston. It was a civil case, not criminal, Patricia had explained, because we first needed to establish what had actually happened to the money. Criminal charges would come later if warranted. My uncle had shown up in an expensive suit. He'd looked composed, confident. He'd smiled at me with the particular smile of someone who thinks they can talk their way out of anything. Patricia had presented her case first. She'd shown bank records. She'd shown that my uncle had accessed the trust account multiple times over the 9 years he'd been managing it. She'd shown transfers to accounts in his own name. She'd shown credit card charges that corresponded with purchases at real estate listings sites. Then came the question that would change everything. The judge, a woman named Margaret Chun, had looked over her glasses at my uncle with an expression of calm, professional assessment. "Mr. Thompson," she'd said, her voice measured and deliberate, "can you provide this court with the account numbers for the investments where the trust funds have been deposited? I need the account numbers, the financial institutions, and the routing information." My uncle had shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd tugged at his tie. "Well, Your Honor, the investments are held through a private firm, and they have confidentiality agreements and non-disclosure provisions that would prevent me from—" "Account numbers," Judge Chin had interrupted, her voice remaining calm but with an undertone of steel. "Not details about the investments. Not explanations about confidentiality agreements. Just the account numbers where the trust's $340,000 currently resides." My uncle had opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. His composure, which had seemed so solid when he'd walked in, was beginning to crack visibly. We can have my accountant provide those details," he'd said finally, his voice less confident than it had been. "My accounting firm is managing the details. I don't have the numbers with me right now." "No," Judge Chin had said quietly. "I'm asking you directly. You're the trustee. You should know where this money is. Can you provide the account numbers right now?" And that's when my uncle had lost complete control. He'd stood up abruptly, so abruptly that his chair had fallen backward with a loud crash that echoed through the courtroom. "This is absolutely ridiculous," he'd shouted, his face turning red. "You're all acting like I'm some kind of criminal. I'm her uncle. I raised her. I took care of her after her father died. I've been a father figure my entire life. And now you're tearing this family apart over money." His voice had gotten louder and rawer. The carefully maintained composure he'd walked in with had completely evaporated, replaced by something desperate and angry. "I gave 9 years of my life managing this trust responsibly," he'd continued, gesturing wildly. 9 years. And this is the thanks I get? A lawsuit? A judge asking me for account numbers like I'm some kind of common thief? My own nephew, suing me in open court, calling me a liar in front of everyone? This is a betrayal. The bailiffs had already begun moving toward him, their hands ready. "You're destroying everything," he'd screamed, his voice breaking with emotion. "Everything. The family is destroyed now. You've destroyed it all. Nobody cares that I've sacrificed. Nobody cares that I've done everything right." The bailiffs had taken his arms firmly and had begun leading him away from the council table. "I did everything right," he'd continued shouting as they'd removed him, his face contorted with rage and something that looked like desperation. "Everything. And nobody wants to understand. Nobody wants to acknowledge what I've done for this family." The courtroom had fallen into a heavy silence except for the diminishing sound of his voice as the bailiffs had escorted him out, his expensive suit and confident demeanor unable to hide the fact that he'd just confessed, through his own behavior, that he was guilty. After my uncle's outburst, the trial had become much simpler. He'd just admitted, through his behavior, that he couldn't produce the account numbers because they didn't exist. The forensic accountants had taken 6 weeks to piece together the full picture. They'd found transfers from the trust account to my uncle's personal accounts. They'd found wire transfers to real estate companies. They'd found down payments on 3 rental properties, all in his own name, all purchased during the years he'd been managing my trust. The math was simple. He'd taken my $340,000 and used it to buy investment properties for himself. The court had ordered him to return the money immediately, with interest and penalties. The total came to $487,000. The original $340,000, plus $147,000 in compound interest at the legal rate for breach of fiduciary duty. My uncle had no way to pay it. The rental properties were underwater. The market had crashed. He'd taken out second mortgages on his personal house. He was judgment-proof, essentially, except for the fact that he had a good income from his commercial real estate business. The court had ordered wage garnishment, 30% of his income, indefinitely, until the debt was repaid. The criminal charges had come 6 months later. Wire fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, theft. He'd been convicted on all counts and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. My uncle had appealed. Twice. Both appeals had been denied. He's serving his sentence now, in a federal prison in Pennsylvania. He'll be released in 3 years if he gets credit for good behavior. The money I got back didn't feel like a victory the way I thought it would. Getting money doesn't undo the betrayal. It doesn't restore the relationship I'd had with my uncle. It doesn't give me back the 9 years of trust that was used against me. But the money did allow me to buy the house. My girlfriend and I were married a year after the trial. We have 2 kids now. We're building a life with the inheritance my grandmother left me, the inheritance that my uncle had tried to steal. I think about what my uncle said in court. You're tearing this family apart over money. As if asking for what was legally and morally mine was somehow the problem. As if his betrayal was acceptable as long as everyone just pretended it didn't happen. But here's what I've learned. Family isn't destroyed by holding people accountable. Family is destroyed by people who think family ties mean they can do whatever they want without consequences. My uncle had a choice. He could have managed my trust honestly. He could have invested the money legitimately and given it back to me when I asked. He could have been the person he claimed to be. Instead, he chose to steal from me. He chose to lie. He chose to use family connections as cover for criminal behavior. And when he was caught, he chose to have a breakdown in court rather than take responsibility. That's not family. That's exploitation. I don't hate my uncle. Honestly, I don't feel much of anything toward him anymore. But I don't forgive him either. Forgiveness implies that he's sorry. And based on every letter I received from him, the few that made it past my mail, he's still not sorry. He's still angry that he got caught. Patricia, my lawyer, warned me about this. Some people never understand what they did wrong, she'd said. They're incapable of it. All they can see is that they got punished, and in their minds, they're the victim. I've accepted that my uncle will likely never understand. And I've made peace with the fact that his understanding isn't required for me to move forward. What I'm grateful for is the legal system that protected me. The judge who didn't accept his excuses. The forensic accountants who uncovered the truth. The bailiffs who removed him when he lost control. I'm grateful that the law recognized that family connections don't give you the right to steal. That blood relations don't excuse fraud. That being someone's uncle doesn't mean you can betray their trust with impunity. My grandmother left me that money to have opportunities. To build a life. To have security. My uncle tried to steal that from me. But the courts gave it back. And now, every time I look at the house I was able to buy, the house my girlfriend and I share with our children, I remember that sometimes justice does work. Sometimes the system does protect you. Sometimes family accountability matters more than keeping family secrets. And that's worth something.